Good afternoon. I'm your chair this afternoon. I'm Jane Thornton with Manitoba Agriculture. I would like to introduce our first speakers. Welcome to the Let's Talk Livestock at Ag Days, and thank you to MNP for sponsoring this room. Our first topic is purchasing farmland, how to get an edge on the competition. Tere Stykalo, regional ag leader for MNP, is a partner with MNP and a leader of his firm's agricultural services team for southern Manitoba. Tere holds a diploma in business administration from ACC College. Tere is a chartered professional accountant qualifying as a certified general accountant in 1998. Drawing on more than 20 years of experience in public practice and in the industry, Tere works with farmers and owners of small businesses, delivering practical solutions that allow them to achieve their goals. Please help me in welcoming Tere Stykalo.
Thank you. That was a very generous introduction. I'm not sure who wrote that, but we'll take it. Anyway, I'd just like to welcome everyone here, of course, to Manitoba Ag Days. We were here from yesterday, and obviously we're going to have our booth open and running until tomorrow. And I think crowds have been very good, and I think today is no exception to that. There's a lot of people here, and I'm assuming some folks probably had to walk from the other quarter section down the road just to get here. So we certainly know that there's a lot of other speakers and a lot of other places that you could be at to look at some shiny paint, but you chose to come here, so we're certainly very appreciative of that. And as we put together our topic, of course, we wanted to be able to provide something of value to you guys so that when you're listening to us that you're going to take something away and maybe take it back to your operations and maybe have some usefulness out of it. So what we did today is to gather a team of our panels, our professionals within our firm, to try and give you a bit of a perspective as to some of the changing, and everyone here knows that there's some changes happening in our agricultural industry. And we're looking at a lot of value going to be changing hands over the next little while. So getting a bit of perspective and sort of to set the table prior to the panel discussing, just to give you a little bit of background from MNP, in case you're not aware of that. MNP, like we're a professional accounting firm that stretches from the East Coast to the West Coast here in Canada, of course. We have about 18,000 ag clients that we deal with, so gives us a bit of a perspective as far as different operations that go right from the fisheries side of agriculture right to the potatoes on the East Coast and everything in between, and all of the livestock areas that go with that. Our firm is just turned 60 years old, so we haven't been around just from last night. We've been here for a while, and we certainly 60 years old, so that gives us another 5 years we can collect our pension checks, I guess. But we certainly hope that we can be here for another 60 years to provide some value to our clients. Our regions, we operate sort of as a bit of a regional approach. We have a hub office in Brandon here, and we have offices in Portage, Deloraine, Verdun, Moosomin, into, of course, Dauphin, Neepawa, Swan River, and a whole bunch of small day offices in between. So we do have a very good mix of people within our region that we operate in, and of course Winnipeg is a separate region in Manitoba as well. Our hub offices and Winnipeg generally host a team of specialists, right from tax to farm management consultants to forensic accountants and all that kind of stuff. So we do have a bit of depth, and just to give you a perspective on that. We see that there's a shift of value occurring, and I mean, we don't have to sit up here and tell you that things are changing, right? You look at generally the value of agriculture, meaning land, size of farm, all of that stuff is certainly, there's changing of that value today, and there's going to be changing of that value more so in the future. And what I mean by that is that people are going to exit, and there's going to be people wanting to come in, and there's going to be more and more of that happening as we go forward and as farmers age. I think everyone here pretty well knows the stats that the age of the average farmer, I don't believe, is necessarily dropping. It's actually increasing, and therefore by that stat alone, we're certainly going to see some of that value change. And as these farms become more sophisticated, they obviously become more complex in nature. There's different ways of operating, there's different styles of operating, and as they become more complex, there's lots of increase in value. We've seen farmland appreciate over the last little while, and our panelists will address some of that. We've seen farmland appreciate in value a tremendous amount over the last, even talk about the last decade. And is that going to stop? Everybody says, well, this is going to be the high, right? This is going to be the high, but yet it seems like the next month some land changes hands and it's a little bit more or substantially more. And we as a firm, as M&P, has sat back and we sort of realize that, in order for us to actually help our clients a little bit better and to help and to provide some more services to them, our clients need to have that competitive advantage or an advantage both from a seller and a buyer perspective. So someone coming in and wanting to expand the farm and go and buy 1,000 acres or 5,000 acres or whatever that may be, how can you do that in a competitive way that ultimately, the buyer wants to extract, or a seller wants to extract as much value and the buyer wants to pay a reasonable price. So that's kind of the purpose and goal really of what we're wanting to create here. So what we want to do is kind of share our team approach and sort of tell you how and provide a framework and sort of share with you that framework sort of that gives folks a bit of an option versus the traditional exit strategy or purchase strategy and other than sort of the auction realtor kind of approach. So the format, our presentation is obviously going to be a panel discussion. And of course, I'd like to introduce our panelists. They're going to give you a bit of a bio, a little bit of history, what they do in a normal course of a day that they conduct their business. And then we're going to have a few questions, and we're going to get them to answer and sort of simulate a real life strategy and approach that has happened, with our clients as well. One of the things I'd certainly like to these presentations, we can throw information back at you, but we certainly like to encourage some feedback from you. If there's any questions, by all means, put up your hands. We'll try to recognize you. We can have those questions anytime throughout the presentations. Please don't hesitate to do that, because I think that provides value not only to you, but also to your person sitting next to you that's probably thinking the same question. So please do that. So our panelists, I'll start with, to my immediate right, is Patsy Hewitt. Patsy works out of our Brandon office. Of course, we have Matt Boley. Matt Boley operates from our Brandon office as well. We have Eric St. Hilaire, who is operating from our Winnipeg office, and Eric Olsen at the very end, not the best for last, of course, but he operates out of our Winnipeg office as well. So anyway, Patsy, I'll let you start with your introductions.
Okay, thank you, Terry. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah? Okay, great. So as Terry said, I'm Patsy Hewitt. I've been with the firm for about 16 years now. Primarily, I've spent all those years working with producers and the agriculture industry. So what I thought I would do today, I've just got a couple short slides, and I thought what I would do is just speak from, over the last 16 years, what I find to be the best advantage to the clients that we work with, and how I feel that ties to helping you get that competitive advantage, whether it be buying or selling land. So essentially, when I come to work in the morning, I'm working for you. My day is centered around making sure for the clients I work with that I know their goals and that I help you to achieve them and succeed them. So I've just thought I'd touch on how I think we do this. Well, from the get-go, I'll always tell a client when I meet with them, it's so important that we have open communication. The more open you can be with us, the better. So we know where you're at in your stage with your farm planning, if you're thinking about expanding, if you're thinking about getting out. The more information I have about that, as well as your short-term, your long-term goals, both personal, farm, business-related, financial investment, and retirement goals, we can work together as a team so that I can help you as deals or opportunities are coming up. Basically, with a strong understanding of that information, I've got the ability, along with the team that's sitting here, to bring you opportunities for farm sales, opportunities for expansion. Eric will talk a bit about some of the things that come before us, and then help you to guide you through to make sure that the decisions you're making and what you want to do and the end result is going to achieve your overall plans. The other thing I think is very key to having that competitive advantage is that we work together as a team. I know a lot of you will have bankers you work with, investment advisors you work with, lawyers you work with. What I encourage is that we all work together to ensure that your goals, again, and what you want is getting to all of those people that you consider your advisors. as we work together as a team, we can ensure that we can make sure at the end of the day your objectives are met. We can be your liaison between them all so everybody's getting the same message. And I just feel that that really does give you a competitive advantage because you know what you can do, you know what you want, and then we can help you to make that happen. So, Matt?
Thanks, Patsy. So as Terry mentioned, my name is Matt Boley. I'm a partner with MNP, and I'm working our tax specialty group. So we do a lot of things related to tax planning for our clients, whether that's planning at the beginning stages when people are getting into farming, whether it's during their life cycle tax planning to make sure they're maximizing their tax advantage. But then certainly when we're looking at exiting farming, transitioning, or looking at expanding, these are all areas where I can come into play working with a GP, whether it's Terry or Patsy or any of our GPs across our region, to figure out what makes sense from a tax perspective so that, not to necessarily change your business plans, but to make sure you're doing them as tax effectively as possible. And that's the same when we're talking about land considerations. There's tax considerations from both sides of the coin. So when we look at purchasers, the biggest thing we're talking about now is how do you pay off that land debt in a tax efficient manner? The reality is with land prices the way they are, they're not, in many cases, a cash purchase. You're getting some or all of it financed through a financial institution. And, the old maxim always has been, well, we don't want farmland in a corporation. We can't have farmland in a corporation. That's been kind of the mantra that's existed in farming for many, many years. But it's really becoming generational. So, those who are on their, on the end stages of the life cycle of farming, a lot of times the farmland will remain personal because it's fully paid. It's better for transition planning. But when we're looking at people purchasing land, the challenge is when your tax rate inside a corporation is going to be 9% for small businesses beginning in 2019, compared to a 25 to say even 50% rate personally. The challenge is how do you pay off that debt quickly when you're paying that much tax to the government? And so the reality is for those who are expanding their farms and buying new land, in most cases it really, it's almost, you have to buy it in a corporation now because the financial situation just doesn't work if you're buying it personally. And so we see even producers who don't feel they need to incorporate for their yearly operations are now looking at incorporating when they're buying large land purchases, because the reality is that's the only way they can afford to make the payments every year and remain viable. And I think the other thing I'd always advise purchasers when talking about land is be flexible in terms of how you put together a land deal. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a second from the vendor's perspective. But I think with so many people looking to expand and buy land, you can really put yourself at a competitive advantage if you're willing to be flexible in how you structure that deal. So rather than just simply coming in saying, I'm only buying land, I don't want to deal with shares or any kind of tax planning, I just want to buy the dirt. That may put you at a disadvantage to another producer who's willing to come in and say, hey, I'm willing to work with you to structure this so that I can get the land in the same position I would be otherwise, and you can have an advantage from a tax perspective, because two similar offers with the difference of flexibility could put you ahead. And from the vendor standpoint, one of the things we're seeing a lot more of, and Eric will talk about that in a moment, is looking at potentially selling the shares of my company instead of just selling the land. Because, with the use of the capital gains exemption and generally lower personal capital gains rates, that can be real advantageous to a vendor when you're looking at selling and can save you considerable dollars. And you want to structure transactions this way not only to put more money in your pocket, but the reality is if you can sell your corporation, you get the money, you pay your tax, and then you're done. You don't have a corporation to maintain for 20 years. You don't have to worry about, all the filings that go along with that, all the planning that goes along with that. And the money's in your genes, so if you want to travel the world, if you want to build a second home, if you want to, invest the money personally, you can do all those things. So it's definitely advantageous. And I've just run a simple example on a land sale. This is very basic. I'm assuming that basically you've got a company with just farmland in it, and that farmland's been farmed 100% of the time by a husband and wife, and they basically have a $5 million company. So if they paid originally $500,000 to acquire the land, if they were to sell it corporately, you can see that they'd end up with about $3.3 million in their pocket after they pay their corporate and personal taxes. Keeping in mind that there's steps to get to that point where the money's in your pocket. It's not as simple as just simply taking the money and putting it in your jeans. Now, if each of the spouses have their full capital gains exemption left and can sell it personally, they're still going to owe some tax because your exemption is not going to cover the full amount. But now you're talking about only $750,000 in personal tax in this example. You'd be left with $4.25 million in your pocket. And so in this very basic example, you can see that, if you as a vendor can sell your shares, and that's not always possible, but if it makes sense, you could really put yourself in a tax advantageous situation. So again, this is where we work with our clients, because not every situation is this easy. Most of them are not. But it's just to give you a good idea that, hey, opening your mind to other possibilities could lead to some significant tax results. So I'll pass it on to Eric now to talk about the corporate finance side of our practice.
Thanks, Matt. So as Matt mentioned, my name is Eric St. Hilaire. I'm with M&P's corporate finance team. Our corporate finance group, we are transaction advisors. So we help clients sell their businesses. We help clients that are looking to grow, purchase other companies. We help with due diligence services for buy-sell agreements. And we also help clients advise on a multitude of other transactional related services. So I would say that out of all those services that we provide, probably 80% of the work that we do is help clients sell their companies. And we do transactions in all industries throughout Canada. So whether it's agriculture, manufacturing, construction, dealerships, you name it, we help clients package their businesses together, find buyers, negotiate transactions for them, and really help maximize their proceeds and work with them to not only achieve a good deal from a value perspective, but also we work with the rest of the M&P team to make sure that we're structuring those transactions in a tax-effective manner. So I think as it relates to agriculture, I mean, it's no surprise that over the last number of years, there's been lots of consolidation happening. Farms are getting bigger. Purchasers and the vendors are getting more sophisticated along with their advisors, and really what we're doing is we wanted to find a way to help some of our clients when it comes to selling. Is there alternative methods out there where they can not only maximize the proceeds of the sale of a business, but also help them minimize the amount of tax that they're paying when doing so? And so I'll talk a little bit more later on in the panel discussion about the process that we use to do that, and I think that it's really relevant in today's world to have some alternative options if it makes sense. And I think a big part of that is working with your advisors at M&P early on to try to structure your business so that you can take advantage of some of these alternative ways to sell the farm, and just changing the mentality around how a farm sale can work. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion. I think it's really relevant in today's world.
So, is that working? Yep. So for a change, I'm the other Eric in the group, which is kind of new for me. So my name is Eric Olsen. I'm a farm management consultant. I manage the team here in Manitoba. So unlike the other people on the panel, I have a degree in agriculture. I've worked in banking for about 10 years, and I've been with M&P for 20 years now. I did the math. I'm older than you, Terry.
Thanks,
So
Eric.
I have a question for everybody. And it was a real fundamental thing the firm did about 20 years ago when they started the FMC group, because they hired their first Aggie. And my question in the group is, why did they hire an Aggie at M&P, an accounting firm? Because they needed someone in the firm with a personality. See, for a change, you're outnumbered.
He tells that every time.
And they laugh every time.
True story.
So I have a degree in ag economics, so I get to be talk a little bit about what's going on in land prices. And this shouldn't surprise a lot of the producers that are sitting around here. We've got, where's Peter Manis? Pete, it's one of yours. You'll be happy, lots of slides. The green bar is the average price of land in Canada from 1980 to, I think this one goes about 2015. It shows the appreciation of land value. The other one, the dotted line, is basically farm receipts. So it's the revenue you make. And when we look at the price of land, it's a lagging indicator. So as years in the grain industry in the last few years have been a lot better, we see the price of land jumping to keep up. So, and the people that are actually dictating the price of land are you, the producers, because you're the ones bidding on it. So the other piece that's interesting is the squiggly gray line, which is interest rates. So over the last few years, we've seen interest rates be at historical lows. We've had really good years in terms of cash income. The result is we see lots of farmers in the market bidding up land. And often have these comments, people are saying, so who's bidding land? And everybody always thinks the land's too much, but it's classic sales when there's or negotiation, because I know that if you're selling the land, it's probably not worth enough. And if you're buying, it's always cost too much. The other interesting thing when we start looking, to give you a little perspective for Manitoba, we just merged an office in Stratford, Ontario. And so we went out there a couple of weeks ago, and so we always talk, our FMC group, we always kind of look down at Iowa, and the average price of land in Iowa is about $7,000 an acre. Stratford, Ontario, $26,000 an acre was land's going for, and it's being bidded up by farmers are buying it. So again, when you look at land values, you look what's going on, it's really an indicator of the health in the ag economy for the last few years.
So Eric, what kind of farms were that were being sold for $26,000? Like, what are they growing over there?
They're not growing cannabis. So in that area, mostly what we're seeing is, actually we're seeing small hog and dairy farms, and they're buying small lots. So when you go down there, you're talking 20 to 40 acre lots.
Yep.
Over to you, Terry.
Thanks. Anyway, thanks, panelists. So basically, we got a bit of an outline as to what these guys do and sort of perspective. So now when we look at, so let's look at a sort of a typical example. So I'm going to throw it back to Eric. So I guess, you know, when you have someone that's interested in expanding, because you'll have some folks that you're going to talk to, and you've done, Eric Olsen that is, so you've talked to some people, yeah. You've talked to some people that are saying, well, we want to expand, you know, how's this all going to work? So how do you actually, you know, what should they consider? What are the considerations that they need to have?
So, you're on there. The considerations for buying land and expansion.
Yep.
So the one thing, and I'm just going to talk a little bit more about land consideration, is the price of land is outstripped its carrying capacity. When we look at the price of land right now, we ran some numbers. Usually when you're buying land, you're going to subsidize it with some of your other property now. It can't really pay for itself. So the consideration now when you're buying land is, it's really, how does it fit into the operation? And we often hear, well, we need it because it's next door, which is fair because it's efficient. But really, when you're looking at buying land now, you're looking at almost as an investment, because you're looking at what am I paying for it? What's it going to be worth down the road? And it's changed the perspective, because it's really big values now. And that's when clients talk to us about land, that's some of the discussions we're starting to have, is about the investment discussion of it. And a lot of cases, depending on your age, you're really buying it for the next generation.
Yep, fair enough. So Eric St. Hilaire, so some of the shift has gone away from just typically, or people looking at sort of another advantage, another way to gain a bit of a step on the next guy buying some land. We've seen some transactions occur that farms are now potentially being sold as a business, not necessarily as a quarter or two or 10 quarters, whatever that may be, being sold as a business. Can you just explain sort of how that works and the advantage to the purchaser in that case?
Sure, and you know, I think a big part of this structure to selling a farm, it was really a way to try and help our clients find an alternative way to do it. That, like I said before, try to save some taxes, try to maximize the value for our clients. You know, we're seeing some succession transitions right now in the market. The baby boomers are looking to retire over the next 10, 20 years, and they're, in certain cases, the next generation, they're not wanting to farm or take over the farm. And so you pair that with the size of farms and the size that they are now, and you're now looking to sell to third parties. You're looking to sell these large commercial farms to outside groups, where, you know, in the past, if you could sell to your neighbor, that option no longer is viable in all cases, especially if you're trying to maximize the proceeds and trying to minimize the amount of tax while structuring the deal. So one of the things that we started doing with our clients is we looked at the sale of a farm no different from the sale of any other business. So if you think of a sale of a manufacturing company or a construction company or a dealership, we look at selling the entire business, and that's the exact same approach with some modifications that we do when it comes to farm sales. So we sell the shares of the business, and when we're selling the shares of the farm, that basically sells everything in one transaction. So we're selling not only the land, but the equipment, the inventory, the working capital, the infrastructure, everything in that farm corporation then goes in one sale. And there's a lot of different advantages and benefits to doing it that way. I talked about the tax savings quite a bit. But you're also dealing with one buyer instead of negotiating multiple sets of transactions where you're selling the land through a certain channel, you're taking the equipment to auction, you're paying fees on that, you're stuck with some of the assets that are maybe not as desirable. By doing a share sale, you're getting to sell everything in one fell swoop to one buyer. So it not only is it a little bit less stressful, but it's also faster, it can be cleaner, and like I said, you're maximizing the tax savings by selling the shares of that corporation. So it doesn't work for all cases, but in the cases where it does work, it works extremely well. There's a ton of value add for our clients, and then from the purchaser side, because they're able to buy shares, and because of the tax implication to the vendor, which is so favorable, they're actually able to sometimes buy for less than if they were buying assets, and putting the vendor ahead from an after-tax basis, but also being competitive in that bidding process, which is what Matt talked about. So it's a really good approach to doing it, and I think that if you're thinking of selling the farm, I think that it's never too early to start talking with your advisors, start planning out the structure, start talking with the tax people, the consultants, the accountants, to make sure that you are set up properly when it comes time to sell, and vice versa. If you're looking to buy and you're looking to expand and acquire, making sure that you're talking with your advisors to make sure that you're thinking of all the different ways to do it on a tax-effective basis.
Good, thanks, Eric. So I don't think we're not going to tell you that buying $5,000 an acre land is good or not, or $10,000 an acre land is the number you should think about. But I think we have to take a lot of different things in perspective, and I think tax is always a driver, right? I mean, who here thinks tax is going to go down in the future? Yeah, not too many. So I think there's going to be some effects, and I think down the road, even though there might be some changes to some corporate tax rates perhaps that might be favorable or may not be, Matt, can you tell us sort of so to the purchaser, what's the advantage? What's the advantage of going and approaching someone to actually, I'm going to buy your business as the farm as a business, which includes the land that that we want to have for our expansion plan?
Well, for me, I think certainly it gives you a competitive advantage, as I mentioned before, because ultimately you're coming to the vendor and saying, how can we make this work for you so that I can ultimately end up where I would have been if I just bought the dirt. Oh, there we go. Bought the dirt, but yet you, as the vendor, are in a more satisfactory position on your end, so that the vendor, your deal looks more favorable to, say, as I say, someone who's simply only interested in buying the dirt. And so that's the one approach that I look at when we're talking about tax planning. But to the purchaser side, I think one thing I always have to reassure clients is that as a purchaser, you're in the exact same tax position as you would be if you were to buy the land directly. Because of the way the rules work in the Income Tax Act, the only requirement the purchaser has is to be incorporated. So going into the process, if you're buying shares, whether you're incorporated already or not, you would need to incorporate. But really, if you're looking at these larger deals, chances are if you're not already incorporated, as I mentioned, because of the lower corporate tax rates, you'd be looking to incorporate anyways. So that's usually not really a barrier. But at that point, because of the filings and different things that we do for our clients, once the sale goes through, the purchaser is basically in the exact same situation. So, the first thing people will ask me is, well, why would I buy the shares? Aren't I worse off? And the reality is you're in the exact same position. There are some costs you bear, but sometimes in these agreements, typically there'll be an agreement worked out between the vendor and the purchaser to say, well, give me take $15,000 off the purchase price to cover my costs associated with doing this agreement. So you'll sometimes see that in order to kind of make the purchaser completely whole. But again, with the corporate tax rate continuing to decline, and when we're looking at 9% rates, that puts 91 cents of every dollar you earn up to $500,000 in a given year in your pocket. And so that really makes it more flexible when, Eric Olsen talks about paying off these debts and the land not, typically maybe needing other land to subsidize new purchases. If you've got less tax to pay, that just gives you more in your pocket to be able to make those payments so that you can be more competitive in what you offer for price. So tax shouldn't drive your decisions for land purchases or expansions or sales. You need to do what's in your best interest, but I really believe that with the proper tax plan, you can really maximize your value and also really set yourself apart from others who are looking to buy the same property, because the reality is in today's era, you're not alone in looking for land, and if you don't have that flexibility, somebody else will.
So Matt, can you just go back to, and I think everyone here understands that every farmer per se has $1 million capital gain exemption on the sale of their farmland, right? I mean, I think everybody knows that. But what about the shares? You talk about the $1 million, like how does that work there? Can you kind of elaborate a bit on that?
Yeah, so you know, a lot of people when they think capital gains exemption, they go straight to land, and that's very true. You know, obviously capital gains exemption applies to farmland as long as you meet the criteria in the Income Tax Act. But what people don't realize is their shares of a farm corporation qualify for the capital gains exemption. As long as you don't have more than 10% of your assets being investments or cash or other inactive types of assets, your shares, if you sell them, qualify for the capital gains exemption. And so in my example, if you have two spouses who started the corporation, you know, from scratch, they each could use up to $1 million of their capital gains exemption on the sale of the shares. So on a $5 million sale, right away $2 million has been sheltered using your capital gains exemption. So that immediately puts you way ahead of being able to sell, you know, your land out of your corporation, because now you've literally sheltered the first $2 million for tax. Right off the hop. And you know, depending on who your shareholders are, if you've got kids as shareholders, even they can use their capital gains exemption on the sale as well. So there's lots of planning opportunities as well there. So definitely taking advantage of the capital gains exemption certainly puts you ahead. You know, and even after that, the personal tax rate on a capital gain is going to be less than your corporate rate.
So Matt, can you just elaborate a little bit? Because one of the things will be, what about your equipment that's in your company?
So that's a really good point too. And I mean, the one thing about selling the shares is that you're selling one asset, is the shares. So that encompasses the whole value of your farm. So when you're selling shares, you get capital gains treatment on basically everything. So that's, you know, from your inventory to your, you know, property, plant, and equipment to your land. And so what makes that advantageous is because if you're selling things corporately, you know, if you recapture depreciation that on your equipment, if you do an auction sale, that's going to create straight income. That's 100% taxable, likely at your high corporate rate of 27%. If you look at your inventory, that's full income when you sell, unless you've got optional inventory. Whereas if you can sell the shares, that's all capital gains. So right away, it's only 50% taxable personally. But then if you can add your exemption, that's just icing on the cake. And one thing I will add too about selling personally, I mentioned it before, but I really think it's important, is I've had clients before who will sell their farm, just sell the assets. And they end up with, say, $1 million in their corporation. They've paid their corporate tax, and they're ready to enjoy retirement. All right, we're going to take that trip. We're going to build that cottage at the lake. And then they come to see Patsy at year end or any of our GPs and go, I want that $200,000 out of my company. And then Patsy says, well, you know, if you do a $200,000 dividend, that's going to cost you 40% tax. And then, you know, usually, you know, there's a long silence. And then, you know, then we have to start structuring, well, if we take less out every year, you'll pay less tax, but then you can't do the things with your own money. And you know, all of you have worked hard, and if you're looking to sell your farm, you want to be able to say, hey, I've paid my tax, now I want to live my retirement the way I want to live it.
And I guess I would just add to that, Matt, too. Very good point. Lots of times, sometimes we'll have clients come in and they'll tell us what they've done after the fact. And we can't do a lot of reactive tax planning. We can do a lot of proactive tax planning. So that's where when I made the point, you know, about the open communication, don't be afraid to pick up the phone, call your business advisor, tell them what you're thinking about, have the discussions, because a lot of these options are there for you, and we can save you money at the end, but we can't do much after the deal's done.
And just one other point too, it's really important when we're talking about whether you're selling land or you're selling shares, always make sure you're getting advice from your accountant as to whether you qualify for the capital gains exemption. Because it's easy to kind of throw it, oh, you're selling your shares, therefore I'll use my exemption. But if your company doesn't qualify, and as I mentioned, there are rules you have to follow, you could get a really nasty surprise come after the sale when you're sitting down at year end and going through your taxes, and all of a sudden that $2 million exempt that you thought you had is now zero. And again, we can do lots before the transaction, and you know, whether it's a deal with our corporate finance group, we work really closely, or any sort of transaction. We can't do really a lot after the fact, and so again, getting that advice proactively, I think, is really important.
So I'm going to throw it out. So now we sort of got a good basis as to understanding sort of a different type of an exit strategy for, say, a seller, but what for the vendor perhaps. But what about now the purchaser, guys? And I'll throw it out to the panel, whoever wants to answer it. Knowing that now the purchaser knowing this, or the person that wants to expand their operation and wants to maybe diversify or whatever going, how do they now approach those? What's their advantage now to going to that vendor and trying to make a deal? I'll throw it open to whoever would like to answer that.
So you were talking about I'm selling my land now.
Yeah, so it says someone's going to be there's a vendor out there that's going to want to exit. Now you're the purchaser. How does that purchaser then get that competitive advantage so that they can actually, knowing how the vendor wants to sell, how to structure, how does that benefit the purchaser?
So when you're looking so you're now purchasing land, one of the things that I would suggest is a lot of people here, because they're probably either thinking of selling or buying, but if you're doing on either side, one of the things I think you should do is come back, and so we're here for the MNP, and we've got a team of people, because as farms have gotten bigger, it's become a lot more sophisticated, and it just size and risk has come in. But talking to the team or talking to your lead, like that's when we talk about Patsy or the accountant you work with, and talking about what are my options, what can give me an advantage, and where Tere's talking about, and when you start talking these share structures and different things, is what advantage does that get me? And really what the goal is to talk about, and the two numbers I think so from my side, the two numbers that everyone else can figure out that I don't, is how much do I have to pay, and the other person is how much do I get in my jeans? How much comes out and how much goes in? And when we start talking some of these different tax structures, you might have the ability to purchase land at a lower price that still puts the same amount of money or more money in the vendor's pocket. And that's the competitive advantage, because if you're in this for the long haul, if you can get an advantage on price up front, that puts more in your jeans down the road to be more competitive. I'm not sure if anyone else wants to comment on that.
Eric, I was just going to go along those same lines. So oftentimes, essentially, and hopefully this doesn't get recorded and sent to the government, but what we're trying to do in the tax legislation and the rules is why should you pay more for land and the seller get less for his land and the government gets ahead, right? They get more of the dollars than they really need to. So we can work together with both parties generally, and I've done it before with the purchaser and the seller, to negotiate a deal where seller ends up with the amount of money in his pocket that he wants, purchasers paying what they want, and essentially what we've done is cut out the excess that didn't really need to be paid to the government for tax.
Perfect. So, Matt, I'll defer to you now. So there's a bunch of changes that have happened in the last year, very significant tax changes, probably the most significant likely since some capital gains came in back in 1971. So when we look at some of the changes that are even being proposed in future budgets, how is that going to affect some of this stuff that we're talking about today? How is that going to affect the buyers or sellers of agricultural land or businesses?
Well, I think, in terms of what can happen in the future, I think that's always the big unknown. And, I wish I had a crystal ball sometimes, because I could make a lot of money if I could tell you what the tax changes were going to be in the future, and only time will tell. But I do think the general environment we're in is that, tax planners, and I mean not just in the government, but even in the Department of Finance and the bureaucracy, is that somehow private corporations that you all operate in are somehow getting an unfair advantage to, say, an employee or someone else who's running a self-proprietor business. And I don't agree with that, but that's generally the tenor. And so when you're selling land, or selling assets out of your company, you're left with the company. And so, you might have sold, okay, now I'm done farming, I'm retired, but now I'm left with money inside a company. And as long as it's in that company, the reality is there's always risk that the rules change, and some of the proposals that didn't end up going through could have really adversely impacted people having money inside a company. Those rules have since been backed off from the government, but we still have to be mindful of that. And so if you can sell the shares and end up with all the money tax paid in your pocket, now, not only do you not have to worry about changes to corporate tax legislation because you don't have a corporation anymore, there's a lot of other non-tax costs. You don't have to file a corporate tax return every year. You don't have to file a corporate return legally every year. You don't have to worry about, dividends and T4s and all those things, all the administrative burden that comes along with running a company. And the reality is when you're working and you're getting that 9% rate, it's a real advantage and it's worth the cost. But when you're talking about investment income, which is not favorably taxed inside a corporation, and to top it off, now you can't have the money you want access to because we've got to plan for it over a long period of time or paying a high rate of tax. I definitely look at saying, well, if I can sell the shares and kind of rip the Band-Aid, it's done, and now I can just move on and I just file my personal taxes every year, and it's a lot more straightforward.
Perfect. So Eric St. Hilaire, if you could kind of tell us, so we've got some of the tax side of things, we got maybe some structure kind of things, sort of how the approach that's being used. So can you kind of step us through, and I just want to reiterate that all these panelists have been involved in one of these types of transactions, whether it's a share sale or a hybrid transaction of the sort. So they actually come here with experience in dealing with those structures. Can you sort of give us a sort of a life cycle of how this actually occurs? Like how does this deal happen? Because it's not like your typical phone call to Ritchie Brothers and they come out and deal with this stuff, or to the real estate agent that comes and lists the farm. It's a little bit different. So if you could just step us through some of that briefly.
Sure. So the approach that we would take is we would first do an extensive amount of due diligence on the client that's selling. So we would look at and work with the rest of the team here in terms of looking at yields and soil qualities and risk ratings and vet the equipment, the land, the storage capacity, everything. We do a lot of due diligence on our client. We then take that information, put it together into a package, and then using some of our market intelligence and our databases of potential buyers out there, we put together a buyer list for our clients. And everything that we do is very transparent. We work with our clients. It's a collaborative approach. They approve everything that we do. They vet the buyer list that we put together for them. And we don't post our farm sales on a website. It's not public. We're the ones reaching out to these buyers. We're the ones bringing them the deals. And what's unique about it is that they don't see any information from our clients until they sign confidentiality agreements, NDAs, with us. At that point in time, then they get the information. They're allowed to review for a period of time, ask us questions, do site visits. And really the goal of this entire process is to funnel all the buyers down a path where we're now asking for offers on one specific date. And the goal there is to get as many offers as possible so that we maximize our leverage and negotiating power in the hopes of negotiating the best deal for our client. Once we've done that, we then work hand in hand with the lawyers to make sure that the deal is papered and ultimately closing. And along the way, we're collaborating with the farm management consulting team, the tax team, the accounting team, really making sure that we're protecting our client and putting them in the best position possible. And so it's a little bit different than the standard approach, but it has a lot of advantages that go along with it, and some of them I touched on previously.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Eric. So one thing we've asked some questions here that are sort of typical. I haven't seen a lot of hands go up, so I'm going to offer the opportunity. If anybody have any questions that we can sort of help address, or maybe these panelists can give you some direction on. You know, how many guys out there are actually, you know, thinking of expanding the farm, or if their opportunity comes up, is there an expansion plan in place? So, yeah, fair enough. So I'll throw the question out there. Did anybody kind of think that process was available, that you could actually maybe look at it a little differently?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, so common shares and preferred shares are treated the exact same way under the Income Tax Act. So typically how the sale would work in that scenario is if you were to go back to my example on a $5 million sale, basically whoever held the preferred shares would get paid first. So if, say, there was a $5 million farm, but there was $1 million of outstanding preferred shares, those shares would be sold, and then the remaining $4 million would get paid to then whoever the common shareholders are. So yes, they all get the same tax treatment. The capital gains exemption is available in those circumstances.
Any other questions? Yep.
We're in a situation where we're up against the ceiling on small business. Why is it that the accountants out there are not encouraging butterflying companies when they get set up?
Okay. Matt, would you like to address that?
Well, I mean, certainly, you know, if we look at butterflying transactions, and just for those of you in the room, when we talk about butterflying, it's basically taking one company and butterflying it into more than one company. And so we do look at butterfly transactions when companies start getting to a certain size. And the one thing we have to be careful of, though, is when we're dealing with transactions, they're purely motivated by avoiding the small business grind or trying to get to small business limits. We always have to be careful of the general anti-avoidance rule. We also have to be careful of there's rules in the Act that basically say if you've done something simply to get to small business limits or to avoid the grind, we're going to really undo what you've done. And so one of the things we always look at is that, in a butterfly transaction, for example, we might butterfly out the land to be, one related person owns that company and then have the farm operations owned by someone else, in order to, maximize small business limit. But we need to make sure then whoever is owning that land co actually is involved with the land, there's negotiated rent, that it's actually a legitimate business transaction, because there are rules in the Act that say, well, if say you put, your spouse as owns the land co and the producer owns the farm co, but yet the producer decides all the decisions on when to buy and sell land, the producer decides what rent's going to be paid, and the spouse is more just signing paperwork. If CRA audits that, they're going to say, well, no, you're basically operating as if it's one company, and all the work that you just did, we're going to undo. And so we don't want our clients investing money into a restructuring to put them at harm's way with CRA. So I would never say no to butterflying. I always look at that as an option, but it's got to work in the client situation, and I don't want to put our clients in harm's way because then ultimately they don't get what they bargained for, and they've paid a lot and aren't further ahead.
Good. Yes, one last question.
Yeah, and we've, on some of the farm deals that we've done it both ways. In some of the transactions, the client was happy to sell the homestead and sell the home section. In some of the deals that we've done, they were really focused on keeping that house and living there. And so you can subdivide the home section and have the purchaser buy the shares of the corporation, buy the farm, yet still have the client retain the home and the personal residence. So it could be done either way. It's really, that's not a deal breaker by any stretch.
Good. Thanks a bunch for your questions. I think we're getting the hook here because there's another speaker that wants to come on. So on behalf of the panelists, from Eric and Matt and Patsy and myself, I'd certainly like to thank you guys for coming here. These guys are going to be available upstairs if you wanted to touch base with them. So thanks a bunch.